Welcome back to segment three or section three, uh, chapter 12, talking about monetary policy. And we're going to spend just a few minutes talking about the challenges of monetary policy. I'm not sure that I would want to work for the Fed because it's a difficult situation. Trying to determine, trying to estimate, trying to forecast, trying to really trying just to get your arms around what's going on in the economy based on data that may be limited, data made that may be um, obsolete, data that may be out of whack from a timing perspective or incomplete. It's not uh, probably not something I would want to do. So I when I was in graduate school at Ohio State, there were several in the econ department or individuals that I knew that took jobs. Their first job out of graduate school was working for one of the Federal Reserve districts, and it was, as I talked to them later, it was somewhat a stressful position. Just a significant amount of stress involved, and I know my first position out of graduate school was working for the Economic Research Service in DC, and it was there was a lot of stress involved in those positions, especially if you were one of the unlucky individuals that were, called into either, one of the Senate subcommittee meetings or something for the House of Representatives and had to testify, or you were in the back of the room in the audience, and your immediate supervisor or the head of the department you work for with being deposed and grilled up front, and sometimes they would, turn and look at you, and it really put you on the spot. So I don't know. Sometimes working for the government, it's not it's not really a bed of roses, but it is what it is. And so with the Fed, there are some challenges to monetary policy, and you've got timing, you got magnitude, and you got effectiveness. And you can make using monetary policy to achieve policy objectives, but these three drivers, let's say, or these three parameters make monetary policy difficult. And we'll kind of take them and stepwise, one, two, three. And so the first one we're talking about timing. It's the authors get into lags in policy, and they actually make a statement which I agree with. Time is the greatest obstacle for any central bank. Um, Takes several months to realize maybe a problem exists. And once they determine a problem exists, the feds can act quickly, but maybe a year or so after that before you even see it's a noticeable impact. Um, I think they give you examples in the book of timing and impacts of monetary policy, and on some of the policies um, that the recession or the inflationary gap was essentially already over before they witnessed it or before they identified it. And again, by the time they got their policies implemented, and it was already moving on to something else. So it's the monetary policy that the Feds use, where they inject or they withdraw reserves and try to work the bond prices, open market operations, try to control interest rates, the money supply, uh, increase, decrease investments, shift the aggregate demand out, bring it back in. It is the lag of policy. It's an extremely difficult situation for the Fed. And when they talk about recognition lag, and so the delay between the time a macroeconomic problem arises and the time at which policymakers become aware of it. And there are examples in history where that, and again, the recognition lag causes significant problems because sometimes it is so severe that you've already gone through the cycle and you've come out the other side before you ever realized that there was an issue to start with. And then you've got implementation lag. And it's a delay between the time at which a problem is recognized and the time at which a policy to deal with it is enacted. And fortunately, for the Fed, because they meet 8 times a year and can touch base with each other on the phone, it's fairly short from the time they identify it to the time they have a policy and the time they implement it. It can happen in a hurry. It's just, we noted in earlier segments of this chapter, it can happen in a matter of hours or days. And they've got the issue identified, they've got a policy in place, and they've got it implemented, and they're off to the races. It goes back on that recognition lag. It's the lack of relevant economic data. And even if you have the relevant economic data or the relevant pieces of a data set, you don't know how dated it is. And a lot of, and we talked in some of the earlier chapters, that's CPI and GDP, and there's initial estimates, there's revisions, and there can be difficult, multiple revisions, different indicators, all working together to drive issues. Look at what happened with COVID. I mean, it I don't want to say turn monetary policy or turn the Fed upside down, but you're talking about a shock to the economy. It really, not only in the United States, but it turned the global economy upside down. And then when you're talking about lags, you've got the impact lag. And that's a delay between the time a policy is enacted and the time that the policy has its impact on the economy. And that can stretch out for months before you know what that impact to the economy is going to be. The impact lag exists because time for the deposit multiplier to process, to work its way, in and out of the economy. The time it takes for firms and households that they need the time to adjust to these monetary policies. So lags estimate, they talk about in the text, lag estimates, range anywhere from 6 months to 2 years when you're talking about the impact lag, because it just does take time for the deposit multiplier to work through the process. And again, takes time for firms and households. Households can move on or can react to monetary policy somewhat quicker than profit maximizing entities can, because there's not as bad as the government, but there's going to be some bureaucracy involved even in profit maximizing entities. Now, if you're at Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos or any of those characters, where you're the driving force of your company, you can probably enact fairly quickly. But if you're a firm with a huge board of directors, and got C-suite, senior managers, and everything's got to work through the bureaucracy, sometimes it just takes a firm a long time to get with the program and try to figure out how they want to move forward. And then secondarily, you've got, what they call political pressures. And the Fed is structured for independence. That's one of the great things about the structure of the Fed. It's structured for independence, but there can be issues with government printing and spending money at the expense of existing money holders. So you've got the Fed sitting over that's independent, but you don't know what, especially on the fiscal policy side, you don't know what the characters in the government are going to be doing, because they don't answer to the Fed, and the Fed doesn't answer to the government or legislative powers. The Board of Governors on the Fed, it's appointed by the president, and it has to be approved by the Senate. Again, that's where we get back to the independence. 14-year tenures are non-renewable. So you can't be fired. You can't be reappointed or reelected, because it's a non-renewable 14-year, service contract when you're talking about Board of Governors. So I don't want to say they can turn their nose up at the government and legislature, but it is a fairly independent um, agency. I hate to use the term agency, but it is fairly independent, and they somewhat travel to the beat of of a different drum, and that beat of a drum is pretty much their own drum. The FOMC is the presidents of the Federal Reserve Bank districts and are chosen by their individual board of directors and approved by the board of governors. So you've got the FOMC. It's chosen by a board of directors, and the board of governors approval. It's not approved by the Senate or House of Representatives or the president. Delicate balance and has to walk a fine line of cooperation with legislation and executive branches. There is the potential to have their charter altered or revoked. And I guess that is kind of the hammer that the government kind of hangs over the Fed's head, but still at the same time, they're independent enough that up until this point, there's been very little changes to their charter since its inception. I will bring up one other thing. If you've got the text, and I hope if you've got it, you've been reading it, but you'll see some graphs in this chapter and in some of the other chapters, and you'll see the term, and a lot of students don't understand it's an acronym, and it's FRED. And I've had students ask me in the past, well, just who is this FRED that generates these graphs and data that we see in the text? It's like, well, it's not a he, it's not a single individual. FRED is the acronym for the Federal Reserve Economic Data. Remember, Federal Reserve Economic Data. That is FRED. So that is the FRED that is generating a lot of the graphs and the data that you see outlined in the text. So again, it's not out of the ordinary for students to bring it up in class or ask questions. Say, I don't understand who this FRED is. I said, this FRED, they'll laugh and say he must work all the time. And where does he get the data? It's not an individual. It's an acronym for the Federal Reserve Economic Data. So that's what FRED is. And so you had now we've moved on from the political pressures. Now we're talking about the degree of impact on the economy. And there's no certainty on if and or when the policies will work. Again, you're talking about lags and will they work? I mean, the authors in the text assume that the Fed is confident in its policy impacts, and the Fed has to at least appear to be confident. You and I both know that when they're sitting in the meetings, there's some level of anxiety over what the policies. Is it the right policy? Have they targeted the right parameters? Are the metrics they're looking at correct? Is the information that's been provided to them? Is it executable type of information to drive a policy? So there's some level of angst and anxiety as they make their decisions. And the second part is how much, and here we're talking about the magnitude of the impact, how much of an impact will it affect? And if you go back to expansionary policies and contractionary policies, expansionary policies are trying to shift the aggregate demand curve outward to close a recessionary gap. If it's contractionary, they're trying to bring the aggregate demand curve back in or downward to close an inflationary gap. And you're never sure what the magnitude is of the policy, what the magnitude of the impact is of the policy when you're trying to manage those inflationary and recessionary gaps. It just, I've heard economists say, well, you pay your nickel and you take your chances, or, it's a crapshoot. And it is to a certain extent, but it is what it is. And, that's the way the Fed operates. And I personally think they do as good a job as most other government agencies, and probably for the most part, they do a better job than other government agencies. And when you're talking about expectations, they talk about in the text about It's is it pulling a rope or is it pushing a string? So, I mean, just think about it. If you've ever um, been manual labor, or maybe when you were in college, especially in a fraternity, they had Greek week and they had games, and usually one of them was tug of war, and you were pulling on a rope, and you know what it means to pull on a rope. So you think about how hard sometimes it is to pull on a rope. What if you're the Fed and you're trying to push a string? Just think about how you would ever push a string. It's next to impossible to push a string. One concept that the authors bring up, and they talk about a liquidity trap. And it's a situation that exists when a change in monetary policy has no effect on the interest rate. And that makes it a really difficult or really bad day to be employed at the Fed. They're also talking about forward guidance, and it's a transparency designed to build confidence in a recovery and confidence in the funds necessary to make the recovery happen. And they talk about COVID when they were implementing monetary policy in COVID, during COVID, and the Fed set the federal funds rate at 0% and pledged to keep the federal funds rate at 0% through at least 2023. And we all know that didn't happen. And again, you think about the business cycle. And we talked about the business cycle earlier on in the text. And remember, the business cycle, it expands, hits a peak, goes down through the recession, hits a trough, comes back out in recession, comes back out in expansion, hits the peak, goes back down in recession, the trough. So it's a cyclical effect on the business cycle. And the Fed wants to have enough forward guidance and confidence in their policies that consumers understand what they're doing and are confident in the Fed's ability to manage that business cycle, and hopefully to take those oscillations and compact those oscillations so you don't experience, especially from a consumer's perspective or from a profit maximizing firm's perspective, you'd rather have them contracted a little than oscillating wildly over time. And then one of the last things that they talk about is rational expectations. How well the public and how well the public anticipates the Fed's actions and then acts on these expectations. All you have to do is listen to Fox Business, CNN, read, Barron's. They've got a Barron's roundtable on Sunday, I guess, and that may be on Fox News. They've got Wall Street Journal. You've got all these talking heads out there that are trying to explain what is happening to the economy and trying to, I don't say manage, but the information they provide, even though they act like they're experts, a lot of them may not be any more savvy than, and for the most part, they probably aren't as savvy as those individuals working for the Fed and trying to move the economy along at a consistent growth rate. And so that's where you're talking about rational expectations, how well the public anticipates the Fed's actions, and then how well they're going to act on these expectations. It's possible under the right circumstances that monetary policy may only be able to impact the price level and is almost powerless to influence the real GDP. And that could very well happen, and it has happened. Rational expectations hypothesis, individuals form expectations about the future based on the information available to them, and they act on these expectations. Again, think about when we talked about the speculative demand for money. That's what you've got the speculators doing. They're developing expectations, and they are taking cash that they're holding and either allocating it to financial instruments. So they're sitting back and holding it and waiting for that right time based on, uh, kind of a hunch that they have or the models that they've developed. And they're trying to time the market and trying to generate profits. So that's where we're talking about expectations. And in the financial market, you have consumers make forecasts about future economic activity and the price level, and then they adjust their behavior to these forecasts. Not only do you have your own personal forecast, and if you listen to an hour on Fox Business, I guess that Maria Bartiromo is on earlier in the morning, and then Stuart Barney comes on, and I don't know who follows Stuart, but they're all providing information, trying to help consumers develop forecasts, develop and manage expectations. And so if you listen to Fox Business and then flip over and listen to CNN, you're going to get a different set of experts with different information, and they're trying to provide a different viewpoint on consumer expectations and how they think the economy is going to move. And that information may be inconsistent with what you hear on Fox, or you may listen to something on Wall Street Journal, and it's just, what do they say about opinions? The one sure thing you can say about opinions is everybody has one. And that's what you run into on a lot of these talking heads is, yeah, they've got an opinion. I've got an opinion. You've got an opinion. Everybody's got an opinion. It's just depending on which of those opinions have the highest probability of being correct. And then I guess the authors make a comment in the text about 1979, Jimmy Carter and Paul Volcker. They slowed the money growth to boost interest rates. And what do we end up with? Just a catastrophic recession. If the Fed provides information, then consumers should pay attention. And that's what I would typically listen to the information that the Fed is providing and then try to distill that information. And yes, you can listen to Fox and you can listen to CNN and you can listen to the other financial news outlets and you can gather information. But at the end of the day, you as a consumer have to make your own determinations on how you're going to interact in the financial markets or how you're going to interact with financial investments. And with that, we're going to stop and we'll come back and I guess we're going to talk about the trade-off between inflation and unemployment. And I think that fourth segment will pretty much finish up chapter 12. Talk to you in a few minutes.